Virginia Rappe was a young and beautiful up-and-coming silent film actress. But when she was only 26 years old, her life was tragically cut short after a wild party at the St. Francis Hotel. Rumors and accusations swirled, and the finger would be pointed at famous comedian and actor of the time, Roscoe Arbuckle. My name is Lauren Elizabeth, and welcome to my channel. I share stories about missing people, true crime, and mystery. I mean no harm or disrespect in doing so, but I do believe it's important to share these stories. If you'd like to see more of that type of content, please subscribe to this channel. Today, we are going back almost 100 years and talking about the unsolved death and possible murder of silent film actress Virginia Rappe. It was 1921 in California. The decade that would later become known as the Roaring Twenties was just beginning. The still somewhat young industry of silent film was thriving, and celebrity culture was thriving right along with it. On September 5th, 1921, at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco, California, a wild party was thrown and attended by a large group of actors, comedians, and film directors. The party was filled with music, dancing, celebrities, and alcohol, which was very illegal at the time during the height of alcohol prohibition. Young 26-year-old actress Virginia Rappe was one of the attendees of this party, and by the end of the night she would end up screaming and writhing in pain, and 4 days later, she would be dead. Accusations and rumors quickly made it apparent that Virginia Rappe's death may have not just been a tragic, untimely death. Someone may have been to blame. Silent film actor and comedian Roscoe Arbuckle, better known for his screen name of Fatty Arbuckle, was being accused of having raped Virginia at that party, injuring her and causing her subsequent death 4 days later. Some now claim this to be one of Hollywood's very first sex scandals. Now, I want to go back and talk a little bit more about Virginia. She was born in 1895 in Chicago, Illinois. Her mother, Mabel Rappe, was an unwed and single mother, which unfortunately was probably looked down upon at the time. Mabel also sometimes worked as a chorus girl, which, for anyone unfamiliar, were the dancers who would dance in a synchronized line, usually in musical theater. Virginia's mother, Mabel, unfortunately passed away in 1906 when Virginia was only 11 years old. Virginia had never known her father, and so she ended up going to live with her grandparents. A few years later, in her early teens, Virginia found an interest in modeling, posing for local fashion designers and artists. As Virginia grew older, she knew she had big dreams and wanted to be a star. In 1915, at the age of 20, she'd spread her wings and move from Chicago to San Francisco, California. The beautiful young brunette quickly made a name for herself as a model and as a fashion designer. In 1916, she caught the eye of a fashion designer named Robert Moskowitz. Virginia and Robert fell in love, and the two were quickly engaged. However, tragedy would strike, and before Virginia and Robert were able to get married, Robert would tragically die in a streetcar accident that same year in 1916. Not very long after this, a heartbroken young Virginia Rappe would move from San Francisco to Los Angeles, hoping to make it onto the big screen. Helped by her beauty, her charisma, and her previous modeling work, Virginia didn't seem to have any trouble finding work in Hollywood. She got her first on-screen role that same year in 1916, playing a small bit part as a salesgirl. It was a small part, but she was on screen nonetheless. In 1919, Virginia fell in love again, this time with Henry Lehrman, a Hollywood director and producer who was 9 years Virginia's senior. By the following year, the two were living together. Apparently, while Virginia's love for Henry was described as intense and beautiful by a friend, it was also apparently rocky, mostly because Virginia wanted to get married and Henry didn't seem to want to. Virginia soon found herself able to work among some of the biggest names in Hollywood and was on track to become a big name herself. After her first screen appearance in 1916, Virginia would go on to be in at least another 9 films from 1917 through 1921. Sadly, it seems that many, if not most, of the films that Virginia Rappe was in are now considered lost films. It's also very possible that she may have appeared in even more films that are not even known about and are lost, or that she was not credited for. And since her longtime boyfriend / kind of fiancé, Henry Lehrman, was a film director and producer, I believe Virginia was in a lot of his films. I was actually able to find 2 of the films that Virginia Rappe was in, and I will link those both down below in the description if you're interested in watching them. One film that Virginia Rappe was in was a film originally titled An Adventuress in 1920, where Virginia played a character named Vannette. This film was later recut and re-released in 1922, this time being renamed The Isle of Love. And it was that 1922 version, The Isle of Love, that I was able to find on YouTube. I was also able to find a short comedy film called His Musical Sneeze, which came out in 1919 and in which Virginia Rappe played a character named Lucy. So now that we know a little bit more about Virginia, let's talk about that fateful night in 1921, the night of the party at the St. Francis Hotel. The party was planned to celebrate Labor Day. It was Monday, September 5th, the last day of a 3-day holiday weekend. The party was hosted by 3 friends: film director Fred Fishbach, director and actor Lowell Sherman, and comedian and actor Roscoe Arbuckle. The 3 of them reserved room 1219, room 1220, and room 1221 at the St. Francis Hotel in California. Despite the ongoing alcohol prohibition of the time, the 3 of them had managed to get plenty of it for themselves and their party guests. They were ready for a proper end to their Labor Day weekend. They were ready for a night of drinking, partying, and general debauchery. From what I can gather, the guests began arriving for this party quite early, shortly before noon on that Monday, so it was set to be a full day and night of partying. Virginia Rappe arrived at the party that morning alongside her friend Bambina Maud Delmont, who simply went by Maud and is mostly what I'll be calling her. Virginia and Maud arrived at the party alongside Virginia's manager, Allison Mancher, who was also a friend of Roscoe Arbuckle. Now, as a result of the combined facts that this incident took place 99 years ago, most of the witnesses were drunk and some may have been motivated to lie, the details about what exactly happened that night are, of course, very foggy. There are conflicting reports from different people and different news outlets that have covered this story over the years, but I will of course do my best to sort out what we know to be true. More guests would pour into the hotel and the party got underway. They had food, music, alcohol, and were ready for a good time. At some point during the party, Virginia Rappe and Roscoe Arbuckle would end up alone together in room 1219. There are some conflicting reports as to how exactly Virginia and Roscoe ended up together in room 1219. Some reports say that Roscoe Arbuckle had persuaded Virginia to come up to the room with him on the pretense of discussing the furtherance of her career in Hollywood. While other reports have said that Virginia was not feeling well, and she went up to room 1219 in order to relax and recover from not feeling well, and at that point Roscoe Arbuckle followed her into the room and locked the door behind them. Roscoe's account is that he was already in the room when Virginia must have came in, and he later found her in the bathroom of that suite. But either way, the 2 of them would end up together in room 1219. And once again, we don't know exactly what happened when those doors were closed. Maud Delmont, Virginia's friend who attended the party with her, said she heard screams coming from the room not too long after the 2 of them had been in there. After hearing these screams, Maud rushed to the room and tried to open the door. After finding it was locked, she began banging on the door. According to Maud, Arbuckle then opened the door in his robe and pajamas. She could see Virginia laying on one of the beds of the hotel room. Virginia was writhing and screaming in pain, suffering from severe abdominal pain. According to Maud, Virginia managed to tell her, "Arbuckle did this," as well as, "He did this, he hurt me, I'm dying." Roscoe Arbuckle, however, claimed that he had found Virginia in the bathroom of Suite 1219 and that she was vomiting and hysterical and trying to rip off her clothes. It has been said that Virginia's allegedly been seen doing this, stripping off her clothes while drunk, claiming that she's uncomfortable or unable to breathe. I'm unsure of whether this was talking about this specific September 5th party, or whether she had been seen doing this at other parties. I'm also not even sure of the validity of that claim in the first place, but it was something that I saw said, so I figured I should mention it. But anyway, Arbuckle claims he found Virginia hysterical in the bathroom. He tried to wipe her down and get her onto the bed and help her, and that was all he did, and at that point, Maud started banging on the door, and that's when he went to let her in. So at this point, all the other party guests are beginning to crowd around and see what all the commotion is about. Allison Mancher, Virginia's manager, suggested that they try giving her a cold bath. Maybe she was just too drunk and needed to sober up. They tried this, but it apparently did not help at all and only seemed to worsen Virginia's pain and discomfort. Maud Delmont also apparently tried rubbing ice on Virginia's belly to alleviate some of the pain she was feeling, but that also did nothing to help. At this point, Maud Delmont and Allison Mancher called the doctor that the hotel had on staff. The hotel doctor apparently said he couldn't seem to find anything wrong with Virginia, and she just seemed to be excessively drunk. A few hours later, now 7 p.m. of September 5th, Maud Delmont called for the hotel doctor again because Virginia's condition had not at all improved. This time, a different hotel doctor was on staff, and this new doctor gave Virginia a shot of morphine to help her through the pain and to help her be able to sleep through the night. The following morning, the same doctor came back, and Virginia was still in no better of a condition. This doctor admitted that it seemed like Virginia was suffering from some sort of internal organ damage. He thought it could likely be a bladder injury, but had no way of knowing for sure or how severe this injury was. This hotel doctor thought it was likely that Virginia Rappe was going to need surgery. Now, due to this being the height of alcohol prohibition, as I've mentioned, and this being a party full of bootleg alcohol, partygoers sadly did not want to take Virginia to a proper hospital. If they took her to a proper hospital, it would likely result in a visit from police and likely involve them getting caught with bootleg alcohol. Instead, Virginia was taken to Wakefield Sanatorium. For anyone who doesn't know what a sanatorium is, it's basically like an old-timey word for a clinic. The Wakefield Sanatorium was apparently largely a maternity clinic and was also known to be a place where illegal abortions would take place. At this time, due to abortion being illegal, it's likely this place would have been a little bit more shady than other clinics, so to speak, and I believe that's why they wanted to take Virginia there, to avoid a visit from police finding out about their alcohol. When Virginia arrived, the initial diagnosis was deemed to be alcohol poisoning. She was admitted to the sanatorium, and over the next few days, Virginia's condition worsened. On September 9th of 1921, Virginia Rappe died after falling into a coma at age 26. And I'm not sure if this fact is confirmed to be true, but I have read it reported that Virginia apparently was telling nurses at the Wakefield Sanatorium before she passed away that Arbuckle had done this. And speaking of Arbuckle, from what I can tell, it seems like him and the other party hosts, Fred Fishbach and Lowell Sherman, got out of San Francisco pretty fast after the party, heading back to Los Angeles on the morning of September 6th, before Virginia had even been taken to Wakefield Sanatorium. After Virginia's death, doctors at Wakefield Sanatorium performed an autopsy on her body. This was actually an illegal autopsy because these doctors were completely unauthorized to perform this autopsy. They concluded that Virginia Rappe had died of a ruptured bladder. They thought that the injury to her bladder had taken place anywhere from 1 to 10 days prior, and they thought it looked like the injury had recently been exacerbated or worsened. They also apparently removed her stomach and some other organs for testing. However, because, like I said, this autopsy had been completely unauthorized, they ended up being intercepted and were required to hand over Virginia Rappe's body as well as the removed organs to another doctor to perform the official autopsy. It was Dr. Strange who was performing the official autopsy. Dr. Strange concluded that Virginia Rappe did have a ruptured bladder, and that she had died of peritonitis. Peritonitis is an inflammation of the lining that surrounds the internal organs. It can cause severe abdominal pain, fever, swelling or tenderness of the abdominal area, and the complications can be fatal. Now, I was a little bit confused in doing my research for this. I'm not sure if the peritonitis was caused by the ruptured bladder, or if they were two unrelated things. From what I can tell, both the ruptured bladder and the peritonitis seem to be the causes of death for Virginia Rappe. According to Dr. Strange, he also believed that the ruptured bladder had been caused by an extreme amount of external force. Maud Delmont, Virginia's friend, was now avidly accusing Roscoe Arbuckle of having raped Virginia in that hotel room. Maud alleged that Roscoe Arbuckle had raped or otherwise sexually assaulted Virginia and crushed her or otherwise injured her in the process, causing the ruptured bladder that would eventually lead to her death. Roscoe Arbuckle was taken into custody on these charges on September 11th, 2 days after Virginia's death. The charge would end up being downgraded from murder to manslaughter. Both at that time and consistently throughout his subsequent trials, Roscoe Arbuckle would insist that he had not raped or killed Virginia Rappe. As soon as word of Virginia's death got out, the media and tabloids were on fire with the story. Just as many media outlets still are today, the media back then was always thirsty for a shocking and salacious story. And this story had it all. Celebrities, illegal alcohol, a dead Hollywood starlet, and now accusations of rape and murder. The media went absolutely wild with this story. They wanted to make this story even crazier and even darker than the reality already was. Many media outlets of the time were seemingly making up details out of thin air. From what I've read, contemporary media outlets of the time printed outlandish, supposed details of the sexual assault. some alleging that Arbuckle had violated Virginia with a glass Coke bottle, others changing the story to a champagne bottle or a piece of ice. They labeled the party as a wild orgy that had gotten out of control. The media was also not against slandering the recently deceased Virginia Rappe either. Virginia, who was the victim in this, was also dragged by the media, who were printing stories about how Virginia was just a loose, crazy party girl who would get drunk and strip off all her clothes at parties. There were also accusations that Virginia Rappe had had several illegal abortions, and I don't see how that would be at all relevant to whether or not she had been sexually assaulted and killed, but those were the stories that the media were running. So I would just like to take a moment to take a closer look at Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle and who he was. Roscoe Arbuckle was born March 24th, 1887, in Kansas. He was considered quite large right from birth, born weighing between 14 and 16 pounds, which was quite a shock to his parents, who were both quite slender in build. This was apparently such a shock to his father, William Arbuckle, that William refused to accept that Roscoe was his own son. I imagine this also would have caused a lot of tension between William and his wife, Mary. William Arbuckle refused to accept Roscoe as his son, and as a result, he would end up abusing and shunning young Roscoe. When Roscoe was around 8, his family moved to Santa Ana, California. Growing up, Roscoe was often bullied in school. He was made a target because of his weight and his large stature. This is where he originally got his nickname, Fatty. What was once a hurtful joke would end up later spiraling into a screen name of a very successful career. When Roscoe was still young, he was invited by an acting group to perform with them at a hotel, and Roscoe quickly learned that he loved and had a talent for being on stage and making audiences laugh. In 1899, when Roscoe was only 12, his mother Mary would unfortunately pass away, and William Arbuckle, having never accepted Roscoe as his own, would cut him off financially and disappear out of his life at that point. Roscoe was on his own, but luckily he was able to find work for himself for room and board at a local hotel. It was while working as a singer in this hotel that Roscoe was discovered. He was invited to San Francisco to work with an acting group. From there, his career skyrocketed, and by 1921, Roscoe was one of the highest paid actors, right alongside Charlie Chaplin, one of the best-known names of the silent film era. So now that we've got a little bit more background on Roscoe Arbuckle, let's get back to the aftermath of that fateful 1921 Labor Day party. Virginia Rappe is dead at the age of 26, and Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle is being accused of having raped and murdered her. All in all, there would be a total of 3 trials to decide Roscoe Arbuckle's fate. The first trial, which was from November 14th through December 4th of 1921, would end up in a hung jury, which is the same thing as a deadlocked jury, which basically just means the jury was unable to come to a decision and therefore a retrial is required. Roscoe Arbuckle's second trial took place from January 11th to February 3rd of 1922. This trial would end up with the same result as the first, with a deadlocked jury. The evidence against Roscoe Arbuckle included pointing to Virginia's fatal bladder injury, which was said to have been caused by extreme external force. The fact that Virginia's clothing had been found torn to shreds, so much so that each garment could not even be identified. There was also the screaming that was heard coming from the hotel room by both Maud Delmont as well as some of the other partygoers. Al Samancher, Virginia's manager, who had been with her at the party, testified in court that he heard Roscoe Arbuckle say that he had violated Virginia with a piece of ice. Roscoe's quote was a bit more crude than that. Virginia's fiancé, Henry Learman, also testified that Virginia had been revolted and disgusted by Roscoe Arbuckle when she had met him previously. Henry insists that if Virginia had have known that Arbuckle would be there, she would have never gone to the party in the first place. Maud Delmont, who had attended the party with Virginia Rappe, had been one of the most prominent accusers against Roscoe Arbuckle, insisting that he had raped and killed her friend. She told police her story during their investigation. However, Maud Delmont would not end up testifying in court. Maud Delmont apparently had a bit of a reputation for getting herself involved with legal cases with wealthy celebrities. There was speculation that Maud Delmont was simply trying to get herself involved and milk Roscoe for everything she could. I don't know how valid any of these claims are, but there are some reports of Maud allegedly having been heard saying things like, "We've got Roscoe right where we want him, he's in a hole," things like that. But once again, I don't know the validity of this, considering this happened 99 years ago. Some believe that Maud Delmont never testified because she was never telling the truth in the first place, whereas others believe that Maud Delmont was telling the truth, but they simply didn't want to call her to testify in court because they didn't want to deal with the possibility of her credibility being called into question. While Maud Delmont herself never testified in court at any of Roscoe's 3 trials, other partygoers would also mention the screams that Maud had said she'd heard coming from room 1219. Alison Mancher's testimony also lined up with the allegations against Roscoe. On the side of Roscoe Arbuckle's defense, Roscoe's story was simply that he had found Virginia in the bathroom of room 1219. She was hysterical, vomiting, and had ripped off her clothing. He tried to help her, wash her up, and get her into the bed. That was it. He hadn't done anything, he had only tried to help. His defense also painted a picture of Virginia having been a drunk, crazy, wild party girl. Roscoe's defense also pointed out that while the autopsy had concluded that her injury had been due to some sort of extreme external force, there were also no bruises found on her body or any other injuries that would insinuate she had been in some sort of violent encounter. I wanted to point out, though, that autopsy photos of Virginia Rappe are available online. I didn't include any in this video just because I know a lot of people are uncomfortable with seeing that. But I wanted to point out there do seem to be visible bruises in this photo. Not severe bruising, but visible bruises nonetheless. If you do want to see those photos, they're easy to find on Google. I see one circular bruise around her upper arm that looks to me personally like it could have been caused by someone roughly grabbing or pulling her arm. So I did want to clarify that there are bruises, but the doctors performing the autopsy concluded that these bruises didn't seem like they were caused by any violent attack. As for the partygoers and witnesses, it seems like they were pretty split. Some of them were corroborating Roscoe Arbuckle's side of the story, while others were corroborating Alison Mancher and Maud Delmont's version of events. Ultimately, on April 13th of 1922, a jury would find Roscoe Arbuckle not guilty, and he was acquitted. The jury even felt so compelled to write Roscoe Arbuckle a letter apologizing to him for the accusations that he had been through, and also urging the public to believe their verdict of Roscoe's innocence. But while Roscoe was found to be legally acquitted, it seemed that the court of public opinion had come to a different verdict, labeling Roscoe Arbuckle as guilty. Roscoe Arbuckle and his films were boycotted from cinemas, and he would never end up working on screen again. Apparently he did manage to find some work in the film industry, now as a director, and I believe under a new name, but it seems like none of those endeavors ever took off either. Roscoe Arbuckle passed away a decade later in 1933 at age 46, after suffering from a heart attack. Now it's been almost 100 years since Virginia Rappe's death, and there are still people on both sides of the coin. Some still insist that Roscoe Arbuckle raped Virginia that night in 1921, causing her untimely death, while others still insist that Roscoe was totally innocent and he was rightfully acquitted. There's also another theory I didn't mention earlier just because, as far as I can tell, this was a theory that wasn't thought of until after Roscoe's trials and until years later. But that's a theory that Virginia's ruptured bladder had actually been caused by a botched illegal abortion procedure. I think this idea may have come from those tabloid reports that suggested Virginia had had several illegal abortions, which, like I said earlier, as far as I can tell, they pulled that information straight out of thin air. As far as I know, it's not known for a fact whether or not Virginia Rappe had any abortions, let alone several. However, this theory of a botched abortion is also supported by the fact that Virginia would end up being taken to Wakefield Sanatorium, which was a maternity clinic and a place that was known to perform illegal abortions. So some think it's possible that Virginia Rappe had already been there earlier or a few days prior to receive an abortion, and so that's why she was taken there later when experiencing problems. However, other people also say, no, she was simply just taken there because all the partygoers didn't want to get caught with their bootleg alcohol, so they wanted to go to a place that was a little bit more shady as opposed to a proper hospital that would have likely contacted the police. Some also think that this would explain why the doctors at Wakefield Sanatorium performed that unauthorized autopsy. Perhaps they were trying to cover their tracks and hide any evidence that they had performed an illegal abortion on Virginia. From my research, a botched abortion of the era could have resulted in injuries consistent with what Virginia had. Although Virginia also had peritonitis, which I'm not 100% sure if that was caused by the ruptured bladder or if peritonitis would be a consistent symptom of a botched abortion in the 1920s. And abortion back in the 1920s was, of course, even more heavily stigmatized than it is today, and was a very illegal and underground procedure. So if Virginia did have one, it would have been a huge risk to her, both physically and socially. So if she did have one, it would likely be a very well-kept secret, So it is possible that she did and no one knew about it. So what do I think about this case? I'm honestly not 100% sure. I believe I lean toward the side of Roscoe Arbuckle having had something to do with it. His defense said that Virginia didn't have any bruises or any marks consistent with having been in a violent encounter. But sexual abuse or rape does not always mean violent in the sense of punching or beating. Especially with Virginia likely having been heavily intoxicated, it's possible that she did not have the strength to fight back at all, and Roscoe did not need to hit her or grab her or do anything to cause a bruise. It's possible that Virginia was so drunk, perhaps in and out of consciousness, that she couldn't fight back, and all she could do to fight back was scream, which ended up being the screams that Maud Delmont and other partygoers heard. Virginia's clothing was also found to be torn, utterly ripped to pieces. So much so, it was said that the fabric could not even be identified as garments of clothing. I tried to find pictures of these clothing items, but I could not, unfortunately, but I have seen multiple reports describing them as severely torn up beyond recognition. Even if Virginia was drunkenly ripping off her clothing to try and alleviate some discomfort, as some reports have said, I don't understand why it would be torn to literal pieces. Something just doesn't seem right about that to me. I do also see some valid evidence in the botched abortion theory, but I'm not 100% sure if I believe that theory. Especially since I think a chunk of it comes from those tabloid articles from back in 1920 that I believe pulled information about Virginia straight out of thin air. But it is definitely something I see as still being possible. I also think it's maybe possible that both theories are partially accurate. Perhaps Virginia was healing or already injured from an improperly done procedure, and then she was sexually assaulted by Roscoe at the party, worsening the injuries and ultimately causing her death. But I do find Roscoe's story of I found her, she was hysterical, and I only tried to help to be a little bit hard to believe. I also think it's definitely worth mentioning what a lot of you may have already noticed watching this video. The parallels in this case to modern times. Sexual abuse is a huge problem for women in Hollywood and show business, but not only them. It's unfortunately a huge problem for women everywhere, all over the world. I do definitely think we are, of course, improving as a society, even if the progression is slower than it probably should be. Women and men suffer from sexual abuse every day all over the world. It's a disgusting and heartbreaking problem, but it should be talked about more so that we can work on raising awareness and working towards stopping it. I will leave some phone numbers and resources for sexual abuse victims in the description of this YouTube video, just in case anyone watching this is in need of those resources. So that is the story of Virginia Rappe and her untimely death. Please tell me what you guys think of this in the comments. Do you think Roscoe was rightfully acquitted, or do you think he was guilty of having committed the crimes he was accused of? Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoy true crime content and would like to see more from me, please subscribe to this channel. I'll see you next time. Stay safe, everybody.